A lot to discuss. Let's meet our panel. From Tallinn in Estonia, Marko Mihkelson is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament. Here in our studio, Harlan Ullman is a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council. From London, Alexander Nekrassov is a former advisor to the Russian government. And also with us, John Sitilides is a global risk analyst for Trilogy Advisors. Welcome to all of you. Marko Mihkelson, let me start with you. At this NATO summit, we heard some very tough words from President Trump. He was very critical of NATO members, the allies, saying that they were not spending enough on their common security. At the end, however, he said all's good. He believes in NATO. It's unified. It's very strong. How would you characterize this summit? What did it achieve?
This summit was predictable in many ways, of course. The temperature was up between leaders already a month ago, at least, when we go back to Canada and G7 meeting. And this was predictable, but the President of the United States will raise quite strongly the question of burden sharing. But what really matters is not the unique statements what we heard during the last 48 hours, but what is written in joint communique, the joint declaration, and what were the words of the President of the United States and the Secretary General of NATO at the very end of this summit. And that tells about unity, about necessity of NATO for us today, and also those steps what were agreed among NATO allies today will make NATO more stronger.
So, Marko, no concerns on your part about the future of NATO. You, as far as you are concerned, this is an alliance that is strong.
Yes, 70 years have been very good sort of years for Euro-Atlantic area. We have lived in stability and security, and why to dismantle something which works perfectly and actually serves not perhaps only in interest of members and allies, but also I must ask or argue that the NATO is also important for our neighbors in many ways, because NATO is defense alliance, and in this regard for NATO members is positive to hear that NATO is strong and united.
John, there is something that we hear very often from this White House, from President Trump, a narrative, if you like, when it comes to international organizations, multilateral relationships, and that is that the U.S. is getting a raw deal. We heard that when the U.S. pulled out of TPP or the Paris Accord or the relationship, the trade relationship with China or with NAFTA. In this particular instance, when we hear President Trump talk about getting a raw deal, is the U.S. getting a raw deal?
Trying to divine the mind of President Trump, my sense is that his emphasis always is on reciprocity. He believes that there has been an imbalanced relationship in the NATO alliance between what the European allies expect of the United States, especially in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the fact that we really haven't rethought in any serious way the mission, the purpose of the NATO alliance since the early 1990s. As our colleague just stated, it served a very important, a critical purpose for the West for decades during the Cold War. But what really is the purpose of NATO today? I don't think anyone is talking about withdrawal from the alliance or dismembering the unity, the bonding between the countries. But there is a sense of what are we about? What is the genuine threat from Russia? What is the threat from the Middle East and from terrorism in Northern Africa? And how do we address those issues in a more reciprocal manner? And I think that really is what obsessing the president, not only with NATO, but also with the G7, with multilateral trade agreements. Where is the reciprocity? Rightly or wrongly, that's his focus.
Let me ask Marko about that. Marko, is NATO as relevant today as it was at the height of the Cold War?
For me, this is absolutely obsolete question, because, you know, NATO is today more needed in its core mission than perhaps ever before. There are multiple and numerous threats posed to alliance, to Western world, from east to west, to south. And look, if you talk that you can't understand that where is a danger, let's say, from Russia, then don't forget that there is a war going on today in Europe. A Russian aggression against Ukraine is going on. Still, Crimea is annexed,
right.
And part of eastern Ukraine is occupied, and the war is going on there. But also, don't forget, already in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, occupied 1/5 of its territory,
yeah.
And the only main reason was to stop NATO enlargement to South Caucasus. From very beginning of the 90s, actually, the Russian strategic thinking has been very clear. NATO is threat, NATO is adversary, and all what Russia has done in military reforms and also military planning and exercises is to confront NATO.
All right, let me get the response from Alexander. Alexander, does Russia pose a threat to NATO members?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that NATO is no longer a defensive alliance. A defensive alliance does not creep eastwards and surround Russia and then wage an absolutely hysterical anti-Russian campaign, lying all the time about the aggression Russia poses. And I think at that summit, again, Georgia, it's being announced, will become a NATO member. And this will not, by the way, decrease tension in the Caucasus. This will only inflame the situation there. Now, what I was surprised with by this summit is the hostility between the European members and Donald Trump. Now, I was very carefully monitoring the coverage by the Western European, rather, media of this summit. And I was appalled by the way it was presented, as if NATO was fractured, as if President Trump was making some absurd demands, and so on and so on. Every president before him was asking the NATO members to increase their defense spending. Nothing new, well, apart from the fact that Trump is demanding a much bigger increase, but no, this is nothing new. And yet this coverage was very hostile to Trump, and the coverage of his arrival in Britain continues to be hostile by the European media and especially the British media. So that was very, very surprising for me. And I think that is why they're talking about the fractured NATO summit. They themselves, the European countries, are creating this fractured situation.
Harlan, what did you make of the NATO summit? And are we seeing some kind of fault lines developing between the United States and its allies in Europe?
NATO is tottering. Make no mistake. Mr. Trump's disruptive approach in terms of personalizing the debate made a big difference. In the past, there have been huge policy differences, but there was always the danger of the Soviet Union that constrained these centrifugal forces. That no longer exists. One of the takeaways that Vladimir Putin is going to have from the summit is that none of the NATO members in Europe had the tenacity or the courage to stand up and contradict Donald Trump. He did not tell the truth about Germany and its dependency on natural gas. He made a huge number of other mistakes, and nobody sought to contradict him. Putin will see that as a weakness that he is going to exploit. About defense spending, this 2% limit is nonsensical. NATO spends 15 times more on defense than Russia does. We don't need to spend more. We need to spend it more wisely. Well, that should have been the message that came across.
On that point, President Trump has been calling for this increase in expenditure. And if you listen to the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, it looks like President Trump may have achieved his goal. Let's watch this.
I think that the fact that we had this open discussion has also clearly stated that we will redouble our efforts. And it also shows that the clear message from President Trump is having an impact.
President Trump is having an impact.
If Lord Carrington, who died this week, were Secretary General, or George Robertson, or Manfred Werner, you would have not got that same response from the Secretary General. Stoltenberg admitted that he was trying to keep the alliance together, and therefore he downplayed the differences. The differences have been hugely significant. Yes, NATO signed a 23-page agreement of things that are going to be done, but quite frankly, NATO needs to have political responses to what Vladimir Putin is doing with active measures. But NATO remains a military alliance in which its tools are military, and these military tools are not going to be able to deal with Russian intimidation, Russian propaganda, Russian interference, and so forth. So it seems to me that unless or until we find somebody in NATO who is prepared to make a strong stand and stand up to the president, right now I'm afraid that the alliance is on very shaky grounds.
John?
I think there is going to be a difficult phase for the NATO alliance members going forward for several reasons. One is, as Alexandra noted correctly, that the Obama administration was the administration that got the other parties to agree to this 2% obligation. What's different about President Trump is not just the content itself, but the tone. There's a belligerence and a crudity that I think is very alarming to our European allies. You can speak to dictators that way. They're less accountable to their people. But the question really becomes, what do the presidents and prime ministers of our European allies do? And they have to go back to their voters and explain how they're either withering under that kind of Trump rhetoric or standing up to him if they believe that they are.
The other point is that President Trump is talking to his voters.
Oh, absolutely. But this is what happens in an alliance of democracies. It's not going to be neat. But what Trump is doing is he's pushing the envelope beyond what we've seen any president do in recent decades.
Marko, what do you make of what you're hearing here, that NATO is not all that it seems to be, not all is well in the house of NATO, that it's tottering, as we heard, it's fractured, it's shaky?
One is what we see at the meetings, debates, which are very often also seen for us already in social media. The times are totally different than we're talking about NATO summits in the 90s or even earlier than that. So we have to get used that truly politicians are very directly connected to their voters nowadays, and unfortunately what we can see, yes, strategic issues, foreign policy topics are brought into the internal political debates more often and more colorfully than before. But at the same time, we have to look not only to the rhetorics and the style, diplomatic style, let's say, what President of the United States is doing, but also what we see on the ground. And actually, during the last 2 years, there has been significant growth of Allied presence on the eastern flank of NATO in the Baltic states, in Poland. The US has increased EDI efforts and money going into EDI, European Deterrence Initiative, into the Baltic states and Poland, and presence of troops of the United States is much bigger today than 2 or 3 years ago in Europe.
John, I'll get you in a moment. I just want to get to Alexander. Alexander, how will all this be looked at from Moscow, this call for an increase in expenditure for the initiatives that NATO is adopting right now?
Well, Moscow will be looking at it as expected. But Moscow also knows that NATO is not an effective organization. You have to look at Afghanistan, which was discussed at this summit, and see how NATO basically collapsed during that so-called occupation, when by the end, when NATO pulled out, 70% by now are controlled by the Taliban. The drug trade is enormous and funding terrorism, not just in Afghanistan, but across the world. So NATO showed everyone, the world, that it cannot fight, that it's corrupt, institutionally corrupt, and that basically when a push comes to shove, NATO is not a vehicle to fight. And don't forget another thing, most important thing. The Third World War is going to be nuclear. So they can flex their muscles along the Russian border as much as they want, but that doesn't mean anything. And that is why the Russians think that this is all a bluff, a big bluff that is going on, and that these politicians in Brussels, they keep NATO because it gives jobs to the boys.
All right.
And by the way, hundreds of thousands of boys. But NATO as a fighting force is zero. And Afghanistan proved it.
If Russia understands Afghanistan because it lost there dramatically. But the fact of the matter is we need to deal with Russia with political, not military tools. The very, very effective former Chief of Defense Staff of Estonia, when asked about little green men crossing the border into Estonia, said, I have a simple strategy. I will kill them. NATO needs to have a stronger declaratory political strategy to deal with this. Because unfortunately, Alexander is right. Soviet and Russian military doctrine has always been dependent upon nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have never been dissociated from conventional forces. It goes back to Marshal Sokolovsky and all his work on war. And what we have to realize is there's not going to be a war. Putin has no intention of moving westward. But the fact of the matter is we need political responses, not military responses. And quite frankly, what we've done in terms of increased exercises and military presence has been very minor. One brigade in Poland, 3 rather large reinforced companies or battalions in the Baltics. These are relatively small forces to reassure.
Okay. John?
I think what this whole discussion is revealing, Anand, is that there's been a NATO internal debate before Donald Trump set foot in Europe several days ago. And sometimes we focus way too much on President Donald Trump, and we don't look at what's really very important here about Western security going forward. Inside of Europe, there's a very, very rigorous debate about how to deal with the Russia threat, and there's a divide between the Eastern European countries, especially those former Soviet republics, and Western Europe, which has a little bit more of a lax view, as Donald Trump pointed out regarding Germany. You have Southern European countries such as Spain, Italy, and Greece that are terrified of a potential migration cascade coming into Europe from Africa in the years and decades to come. And there's a debate amongst all the European countries about what to do about the Iranian threat. All of this was taking place before Donald Trump set foot, and all of this will continue after Donald Trump leaves Europe.
Marko, what does it mean to you when you hear of scenarios like a third world war will be a nuclear war, that it actually makes this talk about increasing expenditure for defense or increasing or improving the conventional forces in Europe actually irrelevant? It's going to be a nuclear war.
I think that ever since nuclear weapons are with us, this threat has been around, and there has been many speculations throughout last 70+ years in the world. I don't think that we are going to see anytime soon such a kind of escalations between nuclear states forces in the world politics today that we should be really be afraid of nuclear war. But to come back to the questions about unity and what kind of discussions, debates are going on among politicians here in Europe on NATO or on defense. And I was 2 days ago in Brussels meeting my colleagues from NATO assemblies, member states, and we talked about current state of affairs, priorities for summit, and also threats what we all have, both coming in from east and from south. And I've been in this assembly for years, and I haven't seen such kind of unity, and also unity not only about understanding commonly those different multiple threats, but also what we should do commonly. Also, there is no question today that we have to spend more and more wisely how do we put money into defense. And to Alexander, excuse me, NATO, what you talked about NATO and Afghanistan, this is nonsense.
Go ahead, Alexander, you can respond to that.
Well, I don't want to debate that, because you can look at Afghanistan, what's going on there, and the situation on the ground is worse than before they invaded it. So I don't think we need to go into that. To claim that this is some sort of a defensive alliance which is creeping over Europe. By the way, if you notice, the change of the political map after the end of the Cold War, NATO has completely redrawn Europe. It is no longer Europe that we knew after the Cold War. This is a sort of change. Such a dramatic change was only after the Second World War. So in a sense, NATO is preparing for war. And to say that it is a defensive alliance, that it is sort of, protecting all these countries. These countries in Eastern Europe should never have joined NATO. That was the whole agreement between the West and the Soviet Union. And the West betrayed the Soviet Union, as it betrayed all of its, by the way, opponents and friends and allies. It does it all the time. That is the point. Why should Russia trust the West? Why should Russia believe all these absurd statements that NATO is a defensive alliance? Why?
Again, this is also nonsense to say that NATO is aggressive alliance, it's not defensive, it's expanding, and so. Look what has happened during last couple of days. Even Greece, which is very, very close partner, has been for years with Russia, has expelled diplomats from Athens who started to meddle in Greece's internal affairs in order to stop the possibility for Macedonia to join or start negotiations with NATO. The countries like Macedonia, Estonia, Georgia, or others actually have made a choice, and they would like to be members of very successful democratic political military alliance, defensive alliance, which NATO is.
Okay, I want to make a couple of points. First, I would only hope that NATO is half as powerful as Alexander believes it is, because if that's the case, it's doing quite well. But there are two broader issues. First, what the meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin yield. If there are concessions with Russia, if there is a deal, as Mr. Trump tried to establish with Kim Jong-un, that could be really a game changer. But secondly, as Napoleon and Hitler learned, waging a multi-front war is not smart. The United States is now waging a multi-front war with China and the EU over tariffs, with NATO over the future, and with a whole bunch of other of our allies. And you cannot win a multi-front war. So you've got all these contradictions, and it's not just NATO, but what happens when the tariffs begin to lead to a war with Europe over all these issues with China, so forth. This is not a healthy situation for us, for NATO, or for the global economy.
One point, Harlan, on that meeting next Monday between President Trump and President Putin, there's been a lot of criticism here in the United States about that meeting even taking place. Should it take place?
Absolutely. The question is what comes out of that meeting. I would make a bet that Mr. Trump will say something along the lines that, rather like North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat, Russia is less of a threat. We might see some kind of a deal over Crimea with a referendum, and I really hope we do see a deal over the intermediate nuclear forces and New START agreements, because that is essential. If they can achieve something like that, that will be extremely positive, but I suspect Trump is going to aim a little bit higher.
Alexander, what do you expect to come out of next Monday's meeting between President Putin and President Trump?
Well, first of all, it's their first proper summit. They are going to meet for a proper meeting, and I think they're going to have 1 hour one-on-one without anyone, which is always a worrying thing for the aides and everybody else. I don't think there will be any great announcements made, but this is important for the build-up later. They're obviously going to discuss Ukraine, because Ukraine is the #1 problem for Russia. They're bound to discuss the Middle East, terrorism, and nuclear weapons, cutting down of nuclear weapons. But I don't really see anything dramatic coming out of it, because it's way too early for that.
Marko, what is your view on that? We heard Harlan tell us a moment ago that this is a summit that needs to happen right now. What is your view?
Our view is very clear that our relations here and our security here in the Baltics area depends very much on how the relations between not only United States and Russia go, but also in general Western Russian relations. And if this meeting and this summit will serve in a way to see the lessening of tensions between U.S. and Russia, then it's good for us as well. But there is questions about major principles, and one of the key issue, of course, is a question about annexation by Russia of Crimea. And I hope that the President of the United States will stick to non-recognition policy towards Crimea, as it worked during Soviet occupation time in case of Baltic states?
John?
Well, first of all, if we take a look at the Trump national security strategy that was released in December of last year, the White House considers the U.S.-Chinese competition to be the grand strategic issue for the 21st century. The U.S. doesn't see Russia in the same light. So it's absolutely essential that if Trump has 2 one-on-one meetings with President Xi Jinping, he needs to have a communication directly with President Putin as well. But I think what will be interesting is, how does he move this chessboard? Right, in chess, you move one piece at a time. President Trump moves 10 pieces at a time on the chessboard, breaking all the rules. And just the way a central component of the U.S.-China relationship is about the future of North Korea, to what extent will President Trump use Crimea as a possible concession for significant movement on the Iran issue in the Middle East, which seems to be what President Trump is most hell-bent on trying to resolve in his presidential term.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Arlen Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.